I'm Libby Slappey of the League of Women Voters of Linn County, and it's time for our League of Women Voters commercial. The League is a nonprofit, volunteer political organization which neither supports nor opposes any candidate or political party. The League encourages citizen participation in government and is open to anyone 16 years and older. This forum is part of our voter education efforts to help voters make informed decisions at the upcoming elections. We hope that over the course of this program, you will learn more about the candidates and what they hope to do for our state. So let me say welcome to our candidates, the incumbent, Representative Liz Bennett, a Democrat, and the challenger, George Olmstead, a Republican, in the race for Iowa House District 65. So I'd first like to explain the procedures for our forum, which each candidate received ahead of time. Each candidate will have 2 minutes for an opening statement and 2 minutes for a closing statement, and will get 2 minutes to answer each question. Opening and closing statements will be done in the following order. Liz Bennett will get the opening statement, and George Olmstead will get the closing statement in terms of who goes first. The timekeepers are sitting in the front row. When half a minute of speaking time remains, the timekeeper will hold up a card that says 30 seconds, indicating the speaker has 30 seconds to finish the answer. At 15 seconds, the timekeeper will hold up a card that says 15 seconds. Speakers should stop when the stop sign is shown. If the speakers continue speaking after the stop sign is held up, I will say thank you and move on. Candidates will confine their statements and responses to relevant issues and refrain from personal attacks. This forum is being recorded by Robin Cash of Neighborhood Network News and will be available to watch at the League of Women Voters website, which is lwvlinncounty.org, and www.neighborhoodnetworknews.com. Pro Video is streaming this event at the Pro Video Productions Facebook page. Our league will also tweet the information and have the link on our Facebook page as well. Now, your participation starts with turning off your cell phones or anything that makes an audible noise that could interrupt our forum. If at any point during the forum you cannot hear me or the candidates, please let us know. We request that you, the members of the audience, treat both candidates fairly. We'd like you to remain quiet throughout the forum, no clapping, cheering, or calling out, with the exception that after the closing statements, you may clap for both candidates if you wish. You are encouraged to submit questions for the candidates on the provided pieces of paper. Those are yellow pieces of paper. You'll see them scattered around on your tables. Questions must be addressed to both candidates and must apply to issues or qualifications for their particular office, the Iowa House of Representatives. Raise your hand if you'd like another piece of paper or to have your question collected. We have a panel of league members who review the questions for legibility, clarity, and applicability to both candidates. I will read as many questions as time allows, sometimes combining similar questions, striving to cover a variety of topics. Are there any questions? Okay, we will begin with opening statements. Liz Bennett won the coin toss, so Liz, you have 2 minutes for your opening statement.
Thank you very much, Libby. I think we need to pick up the mic. Can everybody hear from this mic? Okay, great. No? Aha. Everybody, thank you very much for joining us this evening. As Libby Slappey said, I am State Representative Liz Bennett. I'm a 2-term state representative who's had the honor and privilege of serving House District 65 here in Cedar Rapids, and also an assistant leader in the House Democratic Caucus. I want to thank everybody for coming to be here this evening to participate in our democracy, everybody who is watching at home, and also Mr. Olmstead for coming this evening. The Gazette just commented that we've seen a number of candidates not only not show up to talk with editorial boards, but also not show up to talk with voters from the Republican side. So I respect your willingness to come to have a substantive discussion with me and let voters know where you stand. Very simply, my campaign is a campaign for Iowa values. I've had great opportunities here in the state of Iowa, and while it hasn't always been easy for me, the support structure has been here for me to start first at community college, work my way through, earn a scholarship to Cornell College in Mount Vernon, start working here in the state of Iowa, and then start to work in the technology industry. So I think I have both the energy and the perspective to work for progress in Iowa. To me, this means an education that prepares our kids for success. It means fairness, it means justice, it means opportunity, and it also means clean water and health care for Iowans. So I hope tonight that voters will feel free to ask me questions, and I hope to ask for and earn your vote. Thank you.
Thank you. George.
Thank you all for coming. Can you hear me? Okay. I'm George. I'm retired. I used to teach economics primarily at Indiana University Northwest, which is in Gary. I have a record of community service to the community with AmeriCorps Vista, Volunteers in Service to America, Volunteer Income Tax Assistance, and the RISE program, which is a program for people just getting out of jail or prison. I'm not what you'd call a conventional politician. I'm 66 and I've never run for office before, so I'm obviously not going to have a career in it. I am a quiet, shy math geek, and there's a critical shortage of quiet, shy math geeks in politics. And now I understand why. I don't have any big contributors. I've never even met a big contributor, as far as I know, but they're masters of disguise sometimes. I had all this planned out. Oh, what's next? Oh. There are a few things people ask you, what do you want to accomplish? And there's so many things. I'll just mention three. The most immediate one is fix the tax reform, which is not workable. Next is improve the schools and youth services, because all youth today are at risk. And the third is to make government more accountable and get better performance out of it.
Thank you. Okay, going in alternate order from our opening statements. George, you will get the first question. What do you think should be done to prevent future flooding in Cedar Rapids?
Well, I thought that was all planned out, if not done yet. My impression was that the state share of the money had been decided. If it hasn't been, if further decisions are needed, I will of course support state money for the project. And I just think the project should be done as quickly as possible.
Thank you. Liz.
Thank you. This is, of course, a very important topic for everybody in Cedar Rapids. In 2008, I lost a home in the flood, and just like many other Cedar Rapidians did, and no one should go through that again. Of course, when that happened in 2008, we thought that that was a 500-year flood. Well, then just a couple years ago, in 2016, we were in Nubo filling sandbags, urgently trying to build up again, because here comes what could again be another 500-year flood. So of course, we have had some things done from the federal level, the state level, but that is not enough, because we saw the river get high again. and it's going to keep going. The reason for that is because of climate change, because of unstable weather patterns, because of increased rainfall. So I think first of all, the state of Iowa needs to make sure that we are fulfilling our commitment to ourselves and to others to continue to reduce our carbon footprint. We can do that by encouraging clean energy. We can also continue to encourage and practice good soil conservation and averting waters from flowing right into our rivers and creeks and returning them to our aquifers, and making sure that we're, like I said, returning things to the ground. So I think that's a comprehensive long-term view of what we need to be looking at. We do need to be aware that floods are not going to go away. They're going to keep intensifying, so we do need to continue with a long-term plan on that.
Thank you. Liz, you'll get to answer this question first. I'm sorry, George will. Excuse me.
George,
No.
the first one.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I did this the last time. Liz, you're on. IPERS. Are you committed to protecting IPERS as a defined benefit plan for public service workers like firefighters and police officers?
Yes, I absolutely am. I think the state of Iowa has a responsibility to fulfill our promises to the people who have spent their lives working in public service for our state.
George.
As long as its financial condition is somewhere near as good as it is today, yes. So I would suggest that all of you watch, just in case there are attempts to change the balance between contributions and benefits, because we don't want to let its financial condition deteriorate.
Thank you. The next question has to do with guns. Do you think stand your ground is appropriate for Iowa? And George, you get that first.
Say that again?
Do you think stand your ground is appropriate for Iowa?
Oh, stand your ground. I thought you said something else.
Would you use the microphone, please?
I'm going to spend all this time thinking and give a short answer. I don't see that it's necessary. If you have to defend yourself, you can do it without that.
Liz?
I do not support stand your ground in the state of Iowa. The reason for that is because we've seen it play out in several other states where there are court cases where people felt justified shooting for reasons where shooting was not necessary. I fully support, though, the ability of a person to protect themselves, to protect their home. I have supported in the past entering the language of the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution to the Iowa Constitution, and before any conversation of stand your ground, we've had a very good castle doctrine in the state of Iowa. So Iowans can absolutely protect themselves, and I think that Iowans are actually less safe with stand your ground.
Thank you. The next question has to do with Medicaid, and Liz, you'll get it first. What is your opinion of the privatized Medicaid insurance?
Privatized Medicaid has been a fiasco that was rammed through for ideological reasons. We have seen the consequences of this benefiting private healthcare companies to the detriment of some of the most vulnerable Iowans. We saw even Senator Pam Yocum, who had trouble getting doctor's appointments for her daughter who is now deceased. So that's a high-profile example, but it's been a disaster since I was asked about it in this very forum 2 years ago. So I think that we need to look at what we can do to get it back on track. I think that we are going to have to return parts of it to state control, and I think that we need to get back to putting people over profit in the state of Iowa.
Thank you.
Well, it certainly hasn't looked very good so far. I think in general privatization has potential, but if it's not working in a particular case, we can't stay with it forever. So before the question does come up in the legislature, we'll have the audit coming out and we'll have a little more information to go on. And if it's not showing substantial improvement, we'll have to go back to something like the previous program.
Thank you. The next question is an education question. We'll begin with George. What measures do you support to ensure that local school boards stay accountable to us, the taxpayer?
Well, I'm not sure I can do anything about that. They're already elected officials. They already have little ability to raise taxes. So the only people who can make them more accountable is the voters. And so it's up to you. And I would say that you might want to look at the endorsements, because endorsements from public employee unions are not necessarily a good thing. Just before the collective bargaining law was passed, I read, 189 school districts signed contracts suddenly when they didn't have to sign contracts then, so they could give one more contract under the old arrangement that was more generous to teachers. And this is not a sign of a school board that's accountable to voters. So you might want to look at that.
Well, I think that's something that my opponent and I may share some views on, but also differ significantly. I think what's very important about school boards is that they are very directly accountable to the folks who elect them. And what's really sad is that a lot of people don't even vote in school board elections. So for anybody here who doesn't regularly vote in school board elections, or anybody who is watching at home who has concerns about this, I really encourage you to start contacting school board members. Going to school board meetings, anybody can go to school board meetings, and in fact, they're often live streamed or recorded over the internet. So I think that there is a lot of accountability there. I think one of the first things that school boards are accountable for is providing for a good school environment for our kids. I think one of the things that I heard when we were going through the collective bargaining debacle was that we had collective bargaining in place to preserve harmonious relationships between teachers and school administrators. And this was something that worked very well under somebody very popular in this state, our now deceased Governor Ray, who was a Republican. So it was just a real shame to see something that was truly bipartisan scrapped. And I think that the fact that so many contracts were ratified before the changes took place indicated a high level of worry for being able to maintain those good and harmonious relationships that benefit our kids in schools.
Thank you. The next question, and Liz, you'll answer first, has to do with animal confinement. Do we need more regulation of animal confinement farms?
This is something that I'm very concerned about here in the state. Of course, Iowa is an agricultural state. We also have significant problems with our water quality. And I am somebody who believes that if you don't have clean water to drink, if you don't have clean air to breathe, then you really can't have much prosperity beyond that. So I do think that we should be looking at whether or not we can sustain the level of runoff that would be coming from any additional CAFOs, confined animal feeding operations in the state. And since our prior attempts at cleaning up our water under a voluntary system haven't seemed to work, unfortunately, I think that we might have to look at a moratorium until we have something in place to clean up our water.
Thank you. George?
In the interest of saving time, I agree with all that.
Thank you. Okay, the next question, George, you'll be first on this. Do you advocate lowering mandatory minimum sentences for minor offenses?
I would certainly consider it. Right now, I don't know exactly what those minor offenses are or what the minimum sentences are. There are some things like possession of reasonably small amounts of marijuana where the sentences should definitely be reduced. Aside from that, it all depends on the details.
I appreciate that nuanced answer. I think that's a big question. And I understand, the topic that we're kind of getting at. This is a topic in the national scene when we're talking about judicial reform. I would agree with my opponent that there are some things that have been studied extensively where we understand that a mandatory minimum sentence for something like possession of a small amount of marijuana, for example, is something that doesn't help the individual. It doesn't help the family of that individual and does not make us safer. So I think that it is reasonable to look at the mandatory minimum sentences that we have in place through the lens of, are we safer? Are we truly reforming that individual? And is this a good use of, I hate to use this term, but our human capital in society as well as our taxpayer dollars? Because if we are not safer at the end of the day, then it's a waste.
Thank you. The next question has to do with mental health. We'll begin with you, Liz. What do you think is needed to fix the mental health system in Iowa? What will you do as a state representative personally to improve mental health services?
We have a number of different ideas about how we can do this in the state legislature. Over my time in the legislature and listening to different folks who work with our populations in need of mental health services, one of the things that we have consistently heard is that we need more beds for folks in critical situations. Now, the University of Iowa did open up more beds, and that's a good start. But we are still in a situation where people are waiting. People are being asked to go all the way across the state. They're being separated from their families. So we do have to take a look at how can we prioritize the urgency of care for people. We need to make sure that we have enough beds so that we're not having situations like the one that was described to me last year by a constituent of mine, Sadie Nicholson. Her cousin was Chase Nicholson, a young man who was turned away for mental health treatment because when he showed up, he said that he wasn't okay, he needed help, and they asked him, well, are you thinking of harming yourself? And he said, yes. And they said, well, are you thinking of harming others right now? And he said, well, no. They turned him away. The sad fact, though, was that although he did not intend to hurt other people, he was unstable and he was seeing things, and he went on to shoot his family and then leave that residence and go on the road with a gun. So we need to make sure that we do have enough mental health beds so that we don't have to turn somebody away because we don't think that they are an urgent enough case.
Thank you.
Well, I agree with all that too. I'd just like to add that we need facilities as convenient as possible to as many people as possible, and that requiring counties to shoulder too much of the financial burden doesn't seem realistic, and it's going to require a greater effort at the state level.
Thank you. The next question has to do with prescription drug costs. We'll begin with George. What would you propose to make drugs like insulin affordable?
There's only one thing I can think of, which is to help pay for it. Aside from that, I don't know how to lower the price. You sometimes hear these strange idea of buying it from Canada, but that's completely unworkable.
Thank you.
Well, I think there are a number of different things that have been proposed in order to lower drug prices. There are some things that the state could look at doing, and then there are things that we can do on the national level. I am somebody who supports universal health care. I think that a larger buying pool, larger purchasing power would give the public more ability to bargain with the drug companies. And I think that that would be a good start.
Thank you. The next question has to do with guns. Should we allow teachers to have guns in school? And Liz, we begin with you.
Well, I think this is a really interesting question because we've heard some people propose that teachers should be armed, teachers should have guns in school. But what was very interesting was that during the Chapter 20 debate to change public sector collective bargaining, much was made on the House floor of the idea that teachers are not public safety employees. So it seems very strange to me that after we had a big debate where people were very clear in saying that teachers are not public safety employees, that some of those very same people would then be saying that teachers should be armed and teachers should have the responsibility to consider either attempting to shoot an intruder or in some cases shoot a student. I am of the understanding that technically with the appropriate permits it's currently legal, but it's not something that I would support as public policy or any type of attempted fix to our problem with gun violence in schools.
Thank you.
No, teachers should not be encouraged to carry guns or instructed to carry guns or anything like that. No matter if they're trained by the school district or by the state, they won't have as much training as a police officer. Having a police officer in each school is a much better solution than having teachers armed. And knowing that some teachers are armed is going to excite the students, arouse them, confuse them, something. And it wouldn't be good.
Thank you. Our next question is on the topic of clean water. We'll begin with George. Do you support efforts to have polluters pay to have our streams and waterways cleaned up?
Yes, I hope it can be done without driving anyone bankrupt. But when I read about the water problems, I read someone said, you know, not in these exact words, there aren't that many pollution control programs that are voluntary. And there's good reason for that. And yes, I think, oh, have I got this whole question wrong? I think that sources of water pollution should be required to do something about it.
Thank you.
This is one of these questions where I know that there's probably a tracker out there recording me, to use against me someday for out-of-state money to come in and make me look like I hate agriculture or something. Nothing could be further from the truth. I'm a former 4-H kid. Certainly support agriculture. I'm also somebody who, I suppose along the spirit of 4-H, I wasn't somebody who got a trophy for showing up or writing my name on things. I was somebody who was raised to believe that results do matter. And what we're seeing right now for results is that under the programs that we've had, the water is not improving to an acceptable level. I also believe that it's reasonable to say, now, if you're making profits here and you're polluting our water, I think you need to show some responsibility for that, and it's reasonable for us to ask you to do that. So I do certainly agree with asking polluters to foot the bill.
Thank you. The next question is with regard to minimum wage. We'll begin with Liz. Do you favor a higher minimum wage?
Yes, I do. One of the most interesting things that I've seen recently is we've seen a lot of talk about the low unemployment rate in Iowa. And at first, that seems really good, right? Then you dig down and look at the fact that for years and years and years, Iowa has had lower salaries and wages than other states around us, even when adjusted for cost of inflation. And the fact that even though we have such a low unemployment rate and Iowans are working so hard, we have such a high level of children who are receiving Medicaid and children who are living in poverty. One of the things I would encourage everybody to go home and take a look at, or even Google right now, is the United Way's ALICE report on the welfare of children in the state of Iowa. So what that tells me, when we are almost at full employment, people are working multiple jobs, and we have kids living in poverty, is that we need to raise wages. This is the United States of America. No one should be working 40 or 50 hours a week, willing to show up and do the work and still living in poverty.
Thank you.
The current minimum wage is so low that almost no adult makes that little. So it's not having much effect. We could have some increase without it having much effect. A large increase like the one in Seattle would be completely counterproductive. And just in general, if you want people to have more money, it's going to be difficult to do just by ordering it.
Thank you. Our next topic is voter ID. The state of Iowa recently adopted a voter ID law. What are your thoughts on voter ID? And we'll start with George.
I'm in favor of voter ID. I don't see how it can keep legal voters from voting. Voter IDs are free. And the statement you sometimes hear that vote fraud is rare is hard to believe because there's very little information on it. We can't count incidents of vote fraud, so we can't know how many or how few there are. And of course, the country has a long and storied history of vote fraud, and it's not clear when it took a sudden nosedive, so I'm inclined to believe there is still some vote fraud.
Well, I was in the legislature when we passed the most recent voter suppression bill. And one of the most interesting things is that we had studied this here in the state of Iowa, and we found that it really was not happening. Of course, nobody wants vote fraud. Everybody wants fair and square elections, and that's what we have here in the state of Iowa. I think that the bill that we passed here in the state of Iowa was part of a playbook, making it more difficult for elderly people, people who move a lot, students, people who are frequently disenfranchised to vote. And I personally had somebody down in Iowa City who I did have to get involved with voter services with because their ID kept being sent to the wrong place. They couldn't seem to get it picked up, then it was sent somewhere else when they went to school. So this is making it more difficult for people to vote legally. So I do not support the law that we most recently passed, and I think it amounts to voter suppression.
Thank you. The next question is with regard to reproductive health funding. And we will start with Liz. Regardless of your individual views on abortion, do you support funding for centers that provide reproductive health services like education, birth control, STD testing, and these are places that include Planned Parenthood, Unity Point, and the University of Iowa Hospitals and Clinics?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
I do not. The program is not dependent on Planned Parenthood. It is not necessary to have any one provider in the program. And Unity Point is being restored. And if not enough people are being served, I'm sure both parties will try to bring in more providers and make sure that they are.
Thank you. Our next question is the topic is the economy. We'll begin with George. What do you attribute to Iowa's good growth?
Well, it's hard to say. Probably the farm sector has something to do with it. As far as state policy is concerned, if a state is somewhere in the middle in terms of tax burden, it's hard to tell how much difference it makes. All I know is that the states with the highest tax burdens, like California and Illinois and New Jersey, are suffering. Of course, I don't think Iowa is going to turn into one of those states anyway. But the problem in promoting the economy in general is mostly a matter of avoiding self-inflicted wounds.
Well, I think that's a really interesting question, and I think that this might be one of the points in our conversation today where we'll see some differentiation, on either side of this table. And I think that this has to do with how we define what a good economy looks like. So I'm not so sure that we define an economy where our farmers are afraid of a trade war that was started on Twitter, an economy with good indicators. I'm not sure that we define an economy where we see extremely low unemployment, but people making low wages and a high percentage of our children on Medicaid and in poverty, something that we should brag about. I think that we should start bragging about our economy when we have children who get enough to eat at home and don't have to take a backpack home over the weekend. When teachers don't have to stock graham crackers and things like that in their classroom because they know they're going to have a couple kids who are not going to get something to eat at home. When we have folks who can work a reasonable number of hours and who can have a fair shot at things that my parents had a shot at, that are getting fewer and further between. So I think there's a real difference going on in how we define what a good economy is. And I think we have a long ways to go to make the economy good for more Iowans.
Thank you. Liz, we'll start with you on this question. Please state your position on public employee bargaining.
I support collective bargaining.
The collective bargaining law is a mixed bag. There are a couple of provisions I would definitely not have supported. One is the provisions on recertification, and the other one is the rule that wage increases granted through arbitration cannot exceed 2%. The rest of it has hit some of the targets, but not all of them. The problem here is that public sector unionized employees are in a unique situation. One is they have unions when in the private sector less than 10% of people have unions. And the other one is that the people they negotiate with are elected officials. They, as you hear people say, elect the people they negotiate with. And this is a better deal than the rest of us have. Pretty much the only people, we don't have it, pretty much the only people who have it are the people who work for us. And I don't think we can afford it. Now, if it were just a matter of money, I wouldn't be exercised about it. We can afford it. But it affects the quality of public services and the quality of the schools, and that's the part I don't think we can afford.
Thank you. Next topic is Medicare. We'll begin with George. Will you support and advocate for Medicare for all in Iowa if it is not accepted by the federal government?
If someone will give me the money, I will support it. Aside from that, I think it's completely unworkable.
This is a little bit of an unusual question because we would really need to work with the federal government specifically to connect with Medicare, to have Medicare for all. So I'm wondering if what the question or what the heart of the question is would the candidates up here support some type of system to expand health care or something like a public option in the state of Iowa? Something that we could do in the state of Iowa would be a public option, and that is something that I would support.
Thank you. Liz, you answer this next one first. This has to do with LGBTQIA issues. Recently, federal objections seem to want to, seem to want to nullify the acknowledgement of transgender citizens. What do you think Iowa should do in regards to this?
Well, I think that's an interesting question because one of the reasons why I'm so proud to be an Iowan is that for a long time we have protected the gender identity of our fellow Iowans in our state constitution. We should continue to do that. Iowa should be a place where every person has the chance to succeed regardless of their race, their sex, where their parents were born, the language they first spoke, their sexual orientation, their gender identity, anything like that. I think what's going on at the national level is mean-spirited. I think it's pandering to a spirit of hatred I think it's a shame that the administration is trying to erase the existence of transgender people by design. So I'm proud to say that the state of Iowa has stood for equality for all of our citizens, and we should continue to do that.
Thank you. George?
I'm in favor of all equality for all Iowans in the things that are important, but the question isn't very specific about what policy it is, but I assume they have to do with something about restrooms and locker rooms. And these are not the most important places to fight for equality. And the people in the majority deserve a little protection too. Now, if it were just restrooms, might not be so bad. You have a little privacy in restrooms. But it has been extended in some places to locker rooms, and it has been extended, at least in a couple places, to girls' sports. And that just doesn't add up.
Thank you. George, you'll get this next question first. This is with regard to corporate tax credits. Do you think Iowa needs to study the present tax credit system? Should more credits be given?
I think fewer credits should be given. And I think it's very strange that the legislature passed a large tax bill and left this part of it for later. Because, you know, a critical part of any major tax bill is the revenue protection. And now the legislature wants to look at something next year that will upset all that. Those tax credits in general are not a good idea. I would like to say the top bracket for the corporate tax is one of the highest in the country. And if we start eliminating credits and deductions without lowering the rates, it could produce a substantial tax increase that we don't need.
Thank you.
I would say, and this is something that I've talked about since I first started running for office in 2013, before my first election, that we really need to take a look at the system that we have in Iowa. We need to stabilize our budget. I think the bill that we passed last year was highly inappropriate, and it was about elections. We did it at a time where we were already underfunding our schools, already having Iowans who could not get mental health care, could not get a doctor's appointment appropriately with Medicaid. And I think it was really a gift, a delivery to Republican donors. And when I say Republican donors, I don't mean people like my parents back at home who are lifelong Republicans. I mean people who are millionaires and billionaires and pay for the privilege of not paying taxes like the rest of us. So I think that people in Iowa should be paying their fair share. We need to take a look at the efficacy. There's certainly a lot of information in economic development that the deciding factor for companies deciding to locate to a particular state is not necessarily tax credits, but quality of life for their employees. We have long had a problem with our college graduates leaving the state of Iowa. So I think we need to start asking ourselves whether our healthcare, whether our education, whether our natural resources, whether the promise that all employees will be fairly valued in the state of Iowa would be a better attractor, or whether it's simply a tax cut in a state that already has extremely low unemployment.
Thank you. The next topic is immigration. And Liz, you'll begin. Do you support the rule of law when enforcing the current immigration policy? How will you protect Iowa farm workers?
Well, that question has a lot of different parts. So I think, I guess I can't speak for everyone, but I suppose We are a nation of laws. Everybody supports our laws. I think what's really concerning that we've seen in the state of Iowa is that we've seen entire towns decimated, like Postville. So, you know, I suppose in terms of how I would say that I would protect Iowa farm workers is by advocating for a better path to citizenship for people. And certainly by opposing the separation of children from their families and by opposing for-profit companies being paid taxpayer dollars to hold children away from their parents.
Thank you. George?
This is primarily a federal question, of course. My general position on illegal immigration is that there are good reasons it is illegal. And if there's a question about county officials and county sheriffs cooperating with the federal government, even if you believe that most illegal immigrants are assets or at least harmless, it is hard to believe that illegal immigrants who are in jail are harmless.
Thank you. The next topic, puppy mills. We'll begin with George. Iowa is a documented puppy mill state. What will you do to prevent abuse of animals?
I am against puppy mills. It's not something I know too much about, but I will be glad to support efforts to strengthen that law.
I appreciate that, and I appreciate the question. I'm a big, I guess, I hate to use this term, I guess, but you know, I'm a big cheerleader for the state of Iowa. I believe in the state of Iowa. I'm proud of the state of Iowa. As a young person, I've said earlier, I had good opportunities here, and I stayed here because I believe in all the great things that Iowa has to offer. I will absolutely pick a fight with anybody who says anything bad about Iowa. So you have to believe me when I say that my best friend, who was in veterinary school in Colorado, really made me grit my teeth when she told me that in Colorado in veterinary school, they have pointed out that Iowa is the worst state for puppy mills. That's not something that we should be known for. So there are a number of different proposals on the table. I would support any fair and reasonable proposals for animal welfare and humane treatment of animals in the state of Iowa. I also think, not to burn up too much time, but I also think that our federal officials should take the FDA to task. The FDA has made it very, very difficult to look up any complaints against puppy mill breeders. I think as consumers, we have a right to know if breeders have been assessed fines or violations, and you used to be able to see what the violation was, even documented photos. That information is now redacted to the point that it's ridiculous. So I think that that violates consumer protection, it violates animal welfare, and I think our federal officials should be taken to task for that.
Thank you. The next topic is the restoration of voting rights. We'll begin with Liz. How do you feel about restoring the right to vote to felons?
I think that as a goal, what we hope for is a person to pay their debt to society, and we want them to come back to society. We want them to get a job. We want them to get an education. We want them to hopefully join organizations in the community and get on the path to a better life. So I think what goes along with that is having a voice in our government, and I think that we should look at expanding the ability to restore voting rights to folks who have served their time.
This is actually one of those issues I have trouble getting worked up about, but I'll be glad to restore voting rights to felons.
Thank you.
Are there any felons here?
The next topic has to do with TIFs. We'll begin with George. Would you seek to reduce city's use of TIFs except for purposes of its original intended use? Would you seek to reduce city's use of TIFs except for purposes of its original intended use?
Yes. This falls in the category of economic incentives, which all have to be looked at individually, but a lot of them are bad deals, and there's no point in encouraging too many of them.
To be totally honest, this is something that I would need to look at a little bit more. One of my concerns with addressing it from the state level is because the people who do make those decisions are directly accountable to voters at home. Whenever possible, whenever it makes sense, I do like to let local governments make those decisions. Because county officials, city councilors, mayors are directly accountable to voters. So that's something I would have to look at a little bit more.
Thank you. Back to education. Liz, do you support vouchers for private schools?
Well, one of the great things about Iowa is that we have a lot of educational choices in the state of Iowa. And one of the things I was interested to learn when I started researching education many years ago is that we already allot a lot of money to private schools in the state of Iowa. And I didn't know that, I think, before I started researching that many years ago. So I think that's great that, we can kind of give a little bit of help to private education. I'm somebody who has had the benefit both of public education and private education. In my household, I don't know that my parents felt entitled for taxpayers to pay for me to go to a religious private school. My focus as a legislator is making sure that we do have a strong public school system. I do think that taxpayer dollars are for public schools, and until we can fund our public schools appropriately, I think it's inappropriate to look at giving taxpayer dollars to private institutions.
Well, if this were Chicago, I would unhesitatingly say yes, I support vouchers. But in Chicago, there are a lot more people, there's room for a lot more schools in the market. It is quite possible that a voucher program in Iowa, especially in rural areas, will not produce a reasonable number of schools to choose from. I'd also like to point out, there are only 2 charter schools in Iowa. And charter schools have some promise. And if I had to guess, I'd say the reason there are only 2 charter schools in Iowa is the only people who can start them are school boards. Now in some places, universities can start them, nonprofits can start them, some places for-profits can start them.
Thank you. We return to a question on voting. We'll begin with George. Is a provisional ballot always available to an Iowa voter regardless of whether they have an ID?
I don't know. Is the question, should it be?
Is it available?
I don't know.
Okay.
To be totally honest, I would have to refresh my memory on that too, honestly.
Okay. Well, let's move on to marijuana.
All right.
Listen to you guys laughing, come on.
And it's, I have a related question that goes with it. Many states are legalizing marijuana. What is your position on legalizing marijuana, in addition to growing the crop to push the economy? Liz?
Okay, so that's a big question, because a lot of times when I'm asked this question by voters, there's usually, I guess we haven't talked about, I'm going to assume that this question is not about medical cannabis. I'm going to assume that this question is about recreational cannabis, growing recreational cannabis, potentially hemp. A lot of times when I hear about economic growth, people are talking to me about growing hemp fiber, which, we used to grow, in World War II, prior to World War II, excuse me. So to stop beating around the bush, I'm going to be really direct and say that I think that we should decriminalize marijuana. I do not support a view that says we are going to ruin your life to stop you from supposedly ruining your life. This does not mean that I think that we should advocate for young people to be using marijuana. I don't support that at all, but I think that the war on drugs has been costly. I think it's been ineffective. I think it's made us less safe overall. I think we should look at data from other states to look at implementation, and I think that we should look at moving that direction in the future.
The states that have legalized it are gaining experience, and it's important to look at that. And while I don't claim that the research I've seen so far is conclusive, it gives me serious concerns about legalizing marijuana. There are problems like increased marijuana-related traffic deaths and increased admissions to emergency rooms for marijuana overdoses. And the way it's been legalized in Colorado, it's not like any other legal product that, for example, is regulated by the FDA or anything like that. There's no quality control. One cookie or one piece of consumable marijuana can contain 10 times the recommended dose, which may be one reason they're overdoses. And so I have serious concerns about it. Based on what I know now, I would say no, but I'm sure there's other research I haven't seen.
Thank you. The next question is with regard to ethanol. We'll begin with George. Should Iowa continue to subsidize ethanol?
I don't really want anyone to hear me, but no. If this is aimed at climate change, there's nothing Iowa can do about climate change. For Iowa to fight climate change on its own would be like you donating $1,000 to reduce the national debt. Completely trivial compared to the scope of the problem. So if we subsidize ethanol, or if we build more wind turbines and so forth, it won't help solve climate change. It will merely spend money and help us switch from cheaper sources of energy to more expensive sources of energy.
Thank you. Liz?
Well, ethanol is certainly a question, I think, for economists as well as environmentalists. I think when we look at reality, we really would have to take a look and bring all the stakeholders to the table. The ethanol program is important for farmers in Iowa, and so I wouldn't be willing to say that we should make any type of drastic change. So I think that before supporting any type of policy like that, we would really have to bring all the stakeholders to the table and see what that would really look like for Iowans. My opponent did mention some other things. I took the question as more of an economic question. But since we did go there, I am going to reiterate that I do think that we do have a responsibility to the world that we live in to make responsible choices. And you know what the great thing is that green energy is one of the few opportunities that we have. So when we're talking about green energy, we're talking about solar, we're talking about geothermal, we're talking about wind. It's one of the few opportunities that we have to do something that's responsible to one another, responsible to future generations, and also gives us economic benefits. I'm very proud of the fact that Iowa is one of the leading states in wind energy. And you know what's crazy? Is Texas is actually beating us now. So I think it's really interesting that we really crossed the tipping point where even states like Texas are adopting wind energy. So I think that we should keep going in that direction, use the research we have, and we can ethically improve our environment and our economy with greener energy.
Thank you. Next topic is childcare. We'll begin with Liz. 25% of Iowans live in areas that don't have licensed childcare options. What is your plan to address the need for childcare?
So I'll be totally honest, this is an issue that causes me wailing and gnashing of teeth. Because it's true that many Iowans do live in childcare deserts where there are not enough providers. This is holding people back. People who do want to return to the workforce, it's holding them back from going back into the workforce. So there have been a number of different things proposed. To be totally honest at this time, I'm not exactly sure what proposal I would support. But it would be something that I'm very, very willing to work with folks on, and something I think we should prioritize.
Thank you. George?
I don't really know. I think that areas without child care providers are probably sparsely populated areas where the market is not sufficient. So that if the state were to subsidize it, the cost per child would be surprisingly high. And people have been solving this problem for hundreds of years without public subsidies, with neighbors and relatives. And it may be that that's what we'll have to do.
Thank you. The next question has to do with the environment. Could you state your position on increasing sales tax to fund the Natural Resources Trust Fund? And we'll start with George.
Well, this raises a very interesting question, which is, what is the Natural Resources Trust Fund? So I don't feel able to answer it right now.
So REAP is a really important program for our state. One of the things that I mentioned earlier, or maybe alluded to, is that when we're thinking about what we can do to enhance people's connection with the state of Iowa, to encourage them to build good experiences, to stay after college, to let companies know that their employees are going to have a good quality of life here in the state of Iowa, our natural resources are something that are really top of mind. and economic development. So it's really important for a number of different reasons. Even if the environment isn't super important to you, it should be important to you for economic growth. Now, funding the trust is something that voters have authorized. Voters had the opportunity to vote on this, voted yes on it. And so I do think that we should follow the will of the voters and we should fund the trust.
Thank you. The next question, we'll start with Liz. Would you support and advocate a public bank for Iowa similar to the Bank of North Dakota?
I love this idea. This is something I've heard about before, and I think that would be great. I think it would remove some barriers for folks who might have opportunities for traditional financing, and I think that's a great idea, and I'm happy to hear it coming from the public.
No.
Thank you. The next topic, aging. We'll begin with George. Older adults are the fastest growing part of Iowa's population. What will you do to address the needs of aging Iowans?
Don't know specifically, but I am all for meeting the needs of aged Iowans.
This is another one that keeps me up at night with much wailing and gnashing of teeth, because certainly it is something that we have on the horizon here. Of course, we certainly, I'm sure we both agree, that we do want to make sure that we care for our Iowans as they age. And there are a lot of questions about how we're going to do that, especially as many older Iowans, may have family members who've moved out of state, et cetera. There's one thing that I have looked at that's very interesting when we're talking about meeting the needs of caring for our folks as they age, as well as, what are the jobs of the future? What are the good jobs of the future? Where is the market and where is their demand? So if anybody is interested, I really, really recommend going home and Googling or looking at the caring economy. And this is the idea that not only in childcare, but also in caring for folks as they age, we really have a lot of positions that we are going to need to fill. A lot of times when you see political commercials, for people building jobs and what people consider to be good jobs, you see somebody in a hard hat. Those are great jobs. We need those jobs. Those are certainly dignified jobs, but there's an idea that a lot of times when we think about the jobs of the future, we don't necessarily think about, childcare or elder care jobs as quote unquote good jobs, because, in history, as we kind of talked about, we've relied on women's unpaid work and not recognized that as having economic value. So I think going forward, we are going to need to find a way to give that economic value, because otherwise people won't want to do those jobs. And I think that has a scary implication for taking care of our populations as they age.
Thank you. Next topic is local control. We'll begin with Liz. What is your approach to local control for counties and municipalities?
I think local control is something to be respected. That's kind of a big question. So of course, just like when we talked about school boards are accountable to voters. City councils, mayors, county supervisors are accountable to voters. What I think has been really interesting during my time in the legislature is that I've definitely seen some times where folks who sometimes have talked about local control very definitely usurped local control. And one of the times that I saw that was when the Republicans in the legislature actually acted to lower wages. So that was very surprising for me, because I know that, counties, for example, had done research on what would be appropriate minimum wages for their areas. And then a group of people in Des Moines decided that they knew better than those local officials and decided to lower those wages. So it was strange for me to see that happen, and I think awfully telling that suddenly everybody thought that was okay when the goal was to lower people's wages. So I think that, whenever is appropriate, which is probably most of the time, local officials should be making decisions as they are accountable to voters. I think the only time it would be appropriate to act would be, when there is an overall larger interaction with the rest of the state.
Thank you.
See, you're trying to make sense out of what Republicans in the legislature do. This is one of those questions which could be about anything, leaves us to guess what it's actually about. It may be that it's actually about the minimum wage, in which case I'm fine with local control. If it were about tax increases, I would be more cautious. That's about it.
Okay. Thank you. Next topic is farmland. We'll begin with George. How would you seek to address issues posed by absentee ownership of Iowa farmland?
I actually don't see any great problems with it. It may offend some people, but if a farmer is farming land owned by an absentee owner, it may be that farmer can't afford to buy farmland of his own, and so this is how he gets access to farmland. And this is how the agricultural sector, one way the agricultural sector can get access to capital. So I don't see what's wrong with it.
Thank you. Liz.
I think this is another really interesting one because there are different narratives to this. But certainly every year there are farmers who do approach me in the state capitol and express concern over this issue. I think a few of the reasons why people are concerned about it are that when the people who own the land and work the land are living out of state and just reaping the profits, they don't have as much of an interest in what that soil looks like, and what the water in the state looks like, and what the schools that their kids and their grandkids are going to look like. So I think that that's what's been expressed to me about some of the concerns. To be totally honest, I'm not sure exactly what policy we would enact with that, but it makes me think a little bit of the grapes of wrath. And I have to wonder if we have not had a system that has made it difficult for stewards of the land to maintain their land over time. One thing I can say on that topic is that I have taken measures in the past, and I have co-authored a bill in the past to help small farmers in the state of Iowa. I have 30 seconds. But to make a long story short, it would have established a tax credit program for smaller farmers in the state of Iowa. It would have defined smaller farmers. It would have given smaller farmers a preference in produce in state institutions, and that would have been a win-win for us who live in urban areas because we would have better access to locally grown produce, and it would be a good deal for the rural areas because it would encourage more people and younger people who want to care for the land to move there.
Thank you. The next question, another question on taxes. We'll begin with Liz. Large apartment complexes are businesses, but pay residential property tax rates. Would you change that to business rates?
Okay, so this is an interesting one. Nobody has asked me this question on doors. to be totally honest, and nobody has brought me this question yet. So this would be something that I would want to take a look at a little bit further, to be totally honest. I do think there is merit in asking the question and researching it, so I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. George?
I agree with all that.
Thank you. Next question is a women's health question. We'll begin with George. Please state your position on the fetal heartbeat bill passed in the last session.
I've always wondered exactly how the dividing line is drawn, but generally I support it.
Liz?
So during the time when we were debating this bill, I would say that this was one of the most difficult times for me in the legislature. And the reason for that was because women were calling me, emailing me, sending me messages. One or two said that they were telling me things that they had never told anybody before. And I believe that the decision of whether or not to continue a pregnancy is one of the most personal, private decisions a woman can ever make. And I don't think that the state has a role in telling a woman that we're going to force you to continue a pregnancy even though it may endanger your life. Or we are going to decide for you that you must continue a pregnancy even if it means that you might not be able to have future children. Or even that we are going to force you to continue a pregnancy even if it means losing your job or anything like that. The state really has no role telling women anything whatsoever about their personal, private healthcare decisions.
Thank you. Our last question, we will begin with Liz. Thoughts on thoughts on funding early childhood after the $1 million cut last session.
This is another wailing and gnashing of teeth question for me. When I ran for office, I was a trainer for a technology company. And one of the things that influenced me to run for office was thinking about the foundations that people get as they enter adulthood, as they enter the workforce, and understanding not only just in my professional life, but looking at the research on how important it is for people to have that early childhood education start and how it affects them later. So it's really heartbreaking for me to see fewer Iowans being able to access early childhood education. So the dashing of teeth part is that our budget is such a mess at this point, and that Republicans in the legislature have prioritized tax cuts for big companies and big corporations instead of the building blocks for our kids. And it's hard to know where to go from there. So I think we're gonna have to take a hard look at our state budget. We talked about tax credits earlier. We're gonna have to take a hard look at those tax credits to determine whether they really are contributing to jobs in the state of Iowa, good actual living wage jobs. I suspect that some of them probably are not and need to be reconsidered. And I'm not exactly sure where we go from there, honestly. But we do have to make sure that we're not doing any giveaways to folks that aren't benefiting the state of Iowa when our kids aren't getting the start that they should have.
Thank you. George.
I have an open mind about this, which is actually just another way of saying I don't know anything about it. So I'll be glad to look at it.
Thank you. Okay, we have now reached the closing statement portion of the program. George, you will have the first opportunity for your closing statement, and you have 2 minutes.
I had a great closing statement planned, but it was about something that hasn't come up tonight. So I'm not sure what I'll do. I would like to mention one other thing that hasn't come up tonight much, and that's the tax bill. The idea of tax reform, of broadening the base and lowering the rates, is a good idea. The idea of a tax cut at least enough to offset the increase in revenue from the federal tax law was a good idea. As I said before, the idea of putting off work on the tax credits was not. And the 4-year plan and the trigger are completely unworkable. So I will fearlessly predict that the tax laws will be substantially revised before that last round of cuts ever takes effect. There are any number of reasons it's unworkable. Well, one is we don't know that it will take effect in 2023. Actually, I'm even more certain that if it doesn't take effect in 2023, that it will be changed and it won't take effect after that. But the way the law is written now, it could take effect later. And if it takes 5 or 6 years to get to that revenue target, that doesn't mean we've had high revenue growth in the intervening time. And if we have higher revenue growth through inflation, that doesn't make it any easier for us to afford tax cuts.
Thank you. Liz.
Well, I just want to thank everybody again for coming tonight. I think in a very divisive time that can often seem very acidic, we've been able to have a good exchange tonight on the issues, a substantive conversation. And so I also want to thank you, George, for that. Appreciate your perspectives on that in the conversation. In closing, I just want to thank folks for the trust that they have placed in me over the past 4 years. And I just want to reiterate that I'm running for office to make sure that every Iowan can have the opportunities that I've had. Even though I've had struggles, even though I had to work really hard to get through college, I was able to get the resources to get there. Even after I lost a house and got sick with no health care my senior year in college, there were things there to help me along. So I believe in fairness, justice, and opportunity for Iowa, and that all Iowans should have the opportunities that I have had. During my time in office, I've not only made an effort to reach out to everybody across the district, but particularly folks who don't get involved in politics a lot, younger people and students, regardless of partisan affiliation. And I've used my time in a not strictly political sense to advocate and to tell Iowa's story of green energy success on the national level. So if you'd like to know more about that, please check out americascabinet.com, and you'll find me telling Iowa's flood story as well as Iowa's green energy story. That's americascabinet.com. And if you'd like to learn more about me and my background and my positions, I would invite you to please visit www.lizbennett.com. And I thank you again for your time, and I ask you for your trust in this upcoming election, and I ask you for your vote.
Thank you. On behalf of the League of Women Voters, I would like to thank both candidates for their participation tonight. I'd also like to thank the Cedar Rapids Public Library for providing this facility. And to you, the voters, if you haven't already voted, a reminder that you can do so at a number of satellite polling places, including this library, tomorrow, Wednesday, and Thursday. You can vote here at the library between 4 p.m. and 8 p.m. So make the trip back if you've not voted already. Thank you all for coming. I hope to see you at a future forum. Good night.